Hi, class. We're going to do a quick lecture today on the foreign policy of President Reagan during the 1980s. I know last lecture was quite long. That was not the anticipated goal when I created that, but I did know a little bit longer than usual. So I hope you broke that up into chunks because it's a long time to sit in front of a computer for an hour. So today we're just going to do a very quick lecture on foreign policy. Right? So when you think of Reagan, we usually think of two things. One, we think of a booming economy, and then two, we think of foreign policy issues, specifically with the Soviet Union. So we're going to begin by looking over here. So Reagan's foreign policy, I want you to think of in terms of the Cold War. That's the larger context that you have to think of. Last time we mentioned the Cold War in class, we're talking about the ending of the Vietnam War during President Nixon's administration in the 1970s. Right? So in the Vietnam War, that was one of these flashpoints in the Cold War, where Soviet and American forces were, were fighting one another in this what we call this proxy war. Things calmed down for a little bit after that. So after Vietnam fell and became communist, which was an enormous loss by the United States, things were kind of calm for a little bit. President Carter came in, and he didn't want to start any international flashpoints or conflicts with the Soviet Union. Reagan took a very different approach. Reagan wanted to confront the Soviet Union. Now, he didn't want a war. He didn't want to fight anybody, but he wanted to kind of talk really strongly against them. He wanted to loudly condemn the Soviet Union. He famously called them, I think on the next slide, or the two slides, I don't have it, but he famously called them an evil empire. He gave what's called the evil empire speech, where he called them out. He wasn't trying to be friendly with them. He wasn't trying to do what we call diplomacy, where different countries kind of act like they like each other even though they don't. You probably remember when President Trump went to North Korea. I'm sure President Trump doesn't have any love for the North Korean dictatorial state, but he's doing diplomacy. He's just trying to kind of cozy up to them to get something in return later. The freedom of the North Koreans, maybe the dismantling of their nuclear arsenal. So Reagan wasn't like that. Reagan really went after it, okay? So he had a strategy. He thought, all right, well, we can't fight a war against them. We're not going to go to war. But what we can do is we can escalate our own military spending here at home. And if we do that and we make it public knowledge, the Soviet Union then has to use their economic power to fund their own military adventures, which they can't afford because they're communists. And remember, under communism, you have very, very slow economic growth. The economy is not very strong. The workforce isn't motivated. Whereas here, we have a capitalist system in the 1980s that said, okay, we can kind of spend money on whatever we want. We had a lot of money to burn in the 1980s. And you can see that with this chart right here. Okay, so this chart shows, right, real per capita, meaning per person, so it's adjusted per person because you need to do that because the population is always expanding. So of course our spending is always going to grow, but that's not fair. You can't look at the growth of spending if you're not considering that the population is increasing. All right, so per capita, that means per person, national defense spending. And here we're in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. This is the Korean War, then things calm down for a little bit, the Vietnam War, and then we get out of that. And then Reagan came in right here in 1981, and he ballooned our defense spending, right? Absolutely through the roof with the defense spending. And then here, by the end of the lecture today, the Soviet Union collapsed so we could decrease that. And then this is 9/11, right? 2001's right here. So this is our spending since 9/11. And then it ends in 2011 or so. I don't have an updated chart. Right? So he decided to make the Soviet Union match our spending. He kind of called them out, and the Soviet Union, to keep its pride and to keep up with our arms, needed to spend all this money. And this is how it worked. So if you look at the Soviet Union's GDP, if you look at their gross domestic product, meaning how much stuff their country is producing each year, how much wealth they're producing, if you look at it, it actually looks pretty good, right? That here in the late 19th century, when it was still Russia, it wasn't the Soviet Union, but for comparative purposes, the source that I took this from decided to piece them together. Things were pretty bad, right? Down here, this is how much um, money people are making per year. Okay, so about $1,000 per year. It's basically poverty levels, but almost the whole world was in poverty at the end of the 19th century. Here's the Russian Revolution. Things come down pretty hard once the communists took over in 1917, but then they actually turned around and they were getting better as we approached the Great Depression. You see a tiny little slump right here, but things were actually okay during the Depression. They have no data during World War II. They simply did not, keep track of their records. And then after World War II is over, things are actually going pretty well. They have a couple of dips in their economy, but in general, it looks pretty good, right? And then here's 1990. This is where the Soviet Union fell, right around here. This is 89. This is 90. Yeah, well, maybe it's like right over here. So they were experiencing a recession just as they were um, falling, which is one of the reasons. So it actually looks pretty good until you compare it to the United States. So here's a comparison. Here's the chart that you just saw, right? This is the exact same data, right? There's the fall off at the end. And then here is what the United States was doing, right? So we have our Great Depression in the 1930s, and everything's really good during the war. And then we have a recession after the war, because that's what happens after you fight wars. And then things got better through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then we stop in looks like 1990. Yeah, in 1990, because that's when the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, so what Reagan was trying to do here was he was trying to force them to match us. And as you can see, their economy is nowhere near as strong as our economy, right? I mean, their people are making something like, what would you say? That's about $7,500 per year at their peak, right? This is 5,000. Whereas at the same time, Americans are making close to 25. So we're about 3 times more wealthy per person than the Soviet Union was. So we can spend a lot more money than they could. So that was his goal, was to increase military spending, and that kind of force them to spend extra money on their military that they couldn't afford, and that forced them into a recession. Right, so our economic boom under Reagan in the 1980s was at the same time we had this. They had a recession, right, in the 1980s. Right, so here's the 1981. Right, so Reagan got in here. He kind of forced them to make these kind of decisions. They had a horrible recession. Right here comes down. Right, so that's how that worked out. Reagan kind of got lucky in some ways, but he was also in part responsible for that recession in the Soviet Union by forcing them to reallocate their spending in ways that weren't really efficient for their economy. So I'll show you Reagan's speech, famous speech he gave. It's called the Berlin Wall speech in 1987, November 9th of 1987. This is probably his most famous speech, actually. Some historians credit this as being like the first major step in getting the Soviet Union um, to collapse. But we'll talk about who gets credit for what in a moment. I want you to pay attention to what he's saying in the speech, and then I'll kind of fill in the details for you as we go along. Okay. Oops.
Now the Soviets themselves may in a limited way be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state? Or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable. that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
So I'm just going to pause it right there. So he's in Berlin, and he's behind what's called the Brandenburg Gate. This is the wall, right? This is part of the Berlin Wall where you're not allowed. He's in the Western zone, the free zone. Behind him is the Eastern zone. Right? Behind him is the Eastern. So these are all Western Berliners, people who are living under freedom in West Berlin. And remember, Berlin is this kind of island of freedom within this vast ocean of unfreedom, of control by the communist government. So he's giving this speech to the Berliners. And here's the famous line.
Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Okay. And the crowd goes wild, right? Pull that here. So this was an ingenious speech, actually. I'll show you. Show you what he did. That picture that I had paused here before as well. Go right there. So when he gave this speech, he's giving it to West Berliners. But who's his intended audience? I mean, his intended audience is not the free people of Berlin. It's the people who are not free in East Berlin that are standing behind him. So this wall right here is the dividing line between the free and unfree people in Berlin. And his administration decided to take the speakers and invert them. So the speech was actually projected behind him rather than in front of him. So the idea, and they dropped pamphlets through airplanes all over East Berlin where people were not free. And he told, these little pamphlets said, but the president of the United States giving a big speech at this, on November 9th of this year, and you should, come to the Berlin Wall. That's where it's going to be, and you should listen to it. And a lot of historians, Michael Mann is one of them, they argue that this was kind of the very beginning of a popular movement in Berlin, especially among young people who were most responsible for this. Students, high school students, college students, younger people who were just demanding freedoms, demanding what he talked about in the beginning of that speech about reforms, about a little bit of openness, about some, meeting people in the middle a little bit in terms of social control that the communists had at this time. That was like the first thing that really woke up people and said, wow, the American president is behind us. He's calling for this change. And that's a big deal. If the American president speaks out on an issue, we kind of don't think of it as a big deal because we're Americans, but the rest of the world follows our news. On the one hand, you could say, well, it's kind of ethnocentric to think that we are kind of the center of the world, but the truth is we are. I mean, nearly every TV broadcast in the world, other than like little local broadcasts, talk about what's happening in the United States. And it's been that way since the 1940s, since the 1950s. It's just kind of the way it's been. The United States has been the world's global leader since that time. So it's a big deal that President Reagan was saying, listen, if you guys are going to have some kind of a student movement, some kind of protest, the United States has your back. We're calling for these reforms. That went a long way with people of Berlin. Within 2 years, you see this collapse. That's actually, yeah, okay. So, the speech was in 1987. The collapse of the Berlin Wall was November 9th, 1989. I think I said the speech was November 9th. It wasn't. The collapse of the wall was November 9th, 1989. Okay, there's one more video that I'm going to show you on how this actually happened. The only thing they leave out of the video is that after this speech, you started to see protests. First, it was just a couple of dozen people, and then it turned into a couple of hundred, and then a couple of thousand, and then 100,000, and then 200 and 300,000 people every single night in Berlin would come out and hold these vigils and hold these protests. They're always nonviolent, but the news had to cover them because of you can't ignore hundreds of thousands of people in the middle of a city like that. And so the Soviet government tried to start to think of ways that they could satisfy these protesters. And this video right here does a really good job of explaining how this happened, because it's one of these little quirks of history that was kind of like a mistake. It didn't actually intend to do what they did, but this is how it worked out anyway. Okay, on that speed. Okay, last video. 1 second. Just, you couldn't travel in the Soviet Union. You needed a permit from the government in order to travel. And especially you couldn't go from East Berlin to West Berlin. That was absolutely prohibited. But because of replay of that, travel outside the country can now be applied for without
prerequisites, conditions, or family relationships.
Without prerequisites, meaning you don't need to satisfy some kind of form or test, or conditions, or family relationships. In other words, you can leave East Berlin and travel to West Berlin. That's essentially what he said. Right? So it was kind of a mistake, but it all started with this movement from the United States, from President Reagan and the United States in general, to tell these people, listen, we have your back, we have your support, and we're calling on the Soviet Union to implement the reforms that they say that they are considering. So historians have spilled a lot of ink over who was in charge. Oh, I should say here, Bush is actually in charge when the Soviet Union itself was dissolved. The Berlin Wall came down on November 9th, 1989. By 1991, by 2 years later, the entire Soviet Union was dissolved, officially dissolved. Because remember, the Soviet Union is just a union, a collection of countries that all work together, kind of like how the United States is a series of states that works together under one country. So it would be as if the United States said, okay, each state can kind of do whatever they want now. There's not going to be any more unity here. So the Soviet Union officially dissolved itself. It broke up on Christmas Day, 1991. The famous story is that when Gorbachev decided to sign over, the paperwork here, he asked for a pen from his secretary, and the secretary gave him a pen, and he went to sign it, and the pen didn't work. And he threw down the pen and said, even at this last moment, nothing works in the Soviet Union, because nothing did work in the Soviet Union. Because, again, they didn't have the incentives that we have here in the United States. So it was officially dissolved in 1991, but by then, Reagan had already served 2 terms, so it's technically President Bush who was in office once it happened, but historians usually give more credit to President Reagan here. Which leads me to the final point of who is actually supposed to get credit. Do you credit Reagan for putting pressure on the Soviet Union? Or do you credit Gorbachev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union, for actually following through on these things? Because earlier leaders of the Soviet Union would have had the guards who allowed people to go in through those gates killed. The person who you saw during that press conference, he and his family would have been tortured. Horrible things would have happened to them. But Gorbachev didn't do that. He just kind of watched it happen, and he said, okay, here's what's happening. And he was a communist. He believed in communism, but it just wasn't working. There's only so much you can do to kind of prop up a bogus economy. And by the 1980s, you're looking at, about 60 years of that, over half a century of fuzzy math to try to make this work, and everything came collapsing down by this time. So this is a great debate. The truth is they're both really responsible. Reagan should get a huge amount of credit for helping forestall this movement, and then Gorbachev, on the other hand, he probably should get the most credit. He's the guy actually doing this in the first place. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture. I said it was going to be a short lecture. I'm making sure I'm going to do that this time. If you guys have questions, of course, leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, we will begin with more economics, and specifically with the Clinton administration next time. All right, guys.